Starting a Rotax engine sounds simple. Turn the key and go flying. But Rotax engines don't all start the same way. Cold engines behave differently than warm engines. Two-stroke engines behave differently than four-strokes. And if you use the wrong procedure, you can flood the engine, run the battery down, or wear your arm out if you're using a pull start system. In this video, I'm going to explain the right way to start Rotax engines, the difference between cold and warm starts, and some of the most common mistakes pilots make. My name is Roy Beisswenger. I'm a powered parachute instructor, and most powered parachutes fly with Rotax engines. Over the years, I've worked with both the two-stroke engines like the Rotax 503 and 582, and the four-stroke engines like the Rotax 912 and the 912 ULS. One thing I've learned is that good starting habits make the difference between going flying and spending 20 minutes trying to get an engine to start. Before we talk about specific procedures, it's important to understand the biggest difference when starting Rotax engines, and that's temperature. A cold engine normally needs choke, sometimes priming, and it usually needs a longer warm-up period. A warm engine usually needs none of those things. In fact, treating a warm engine like a cold engine is one of the fastest ways to flood it. Once the engine is warm, it starts very easily with just small amounts of throttle and a quick crank of the starter. The reason the procedures are different comes down to how these engines are designed. Two-stroke Rotax engines tend to have very simple carburetors and fuel systems. They normally use a mechanical fuel pump that's driven by the engine itself, and depending on the installation, they may have a primer plunger, a squeeze bulb primer, or a choke system mounted on the carburetor. A primer system injects fuel directly into the intake to help with cold starts, while a squeeze bulb is usually used to fill the fuel lines and carburetor bowls. Many two-stroke installations also have a remote choke control, often located near the throttle. Because of their simple carburation, two-stroke engines can flood very easily, so the starting procedure matters. Some installations even use a pull start system instead of an electric starter, which makes proper starting technique even more important. Four-stroke Rotax engines, like the 912 series, are a little different. They usually have both a mechanical fuel pump and an electric boost pump, and they use an enrichment system built into the carburetors rather than a separate primer. In general, they're very reliable starters, but they could still be flooded if the wrong procedure is used. Understanding what's happening mechanically makes starting the engine much easier. Before touching the starter, there are a few universal safety checks that should always happen first. Make sure the propeller area is clear. If you have a passenger, make sure they're briefed and that their seat belts are secured. Then move on to the basic engine preparation. Verify that the fuel valve is on, confirm that you have adequate fuel, and make sure the mag switches are off until you're ready to start the engine. Another important point is throttle position. Most Rotax engines should not be started with the throttle open. Starting with the throttle applied can make the engine harder to start and increase the chance of flooding. Now let's talk about starting procedures for two-stroke engines like the Rotax 582. When the engine is cold, you normally begin by priming the fuel system. Depending on the installation, that might mean using a squeeze bulb to fill the fuel lines and carburetor bowls, or using a primer plunger to inject a small amount of fuel into the intake. After priming, turn the master switch on, apply the choke for a cold start, and keep the throttle closed. Then turn on the mag switches and engage the starter or pull the starter if it's a pull start installation. Once the engine fires, you'll gradually reduce the choke as the engine begins to stabilize. At this point, it's important to let the engine warm up at low RPM. Two-stroke engines need a little time to build temperature before they're ready for full power. You should see the cylinder head and water temperatures begin to rise, and the engine should settle into a smooth, stable idle before increasing power. Starting a warm two-stroke engine is usually much simpler. In most cases, there's no need to prime the engine and no need to use choke. The throttle can be opened just slightly, just enough to crack it open, and then the engine can be started normally. Two-stroke engines do flood easily, so if the engine doesn't start and you suspect it's flooded, there's a simple way to clear it. Turn the engine switches off, open the throttle wide, and pull the engine through several times if it's a pull start system, or crank the starter briefly if it's electric start. This helps clear excess fuel from the cylinders by airing them out. After that, you can return to the normal starting procedure. Now let's talk about four-stroke Rotax engines like the 912. For a cold start, begin by turning on the master switch and activating the electric fuel pump. Then apply the choke for a cold start while keeping the throttle closed. Turn on the mag switches and engage the starter. Once the engine starts, gradually reduce the choke as the engine stabilizes and warms up. For warm starts, the procedure is simpler. Normally there's no choke required and the throttle can be cracked open slightly before engaging the starter. Warm 2-stroke Rotax engines usually start very quickly. One very important check on 4-stroke engines is oil pressure. Immediately after the engine starts, you should confirm that oil pressure appears within a few seconds. If oil pressure doesn't come up quickly, the engine should be shut down and the problem investigated. Over the years, I've seen a few common starting mistakes. One of the most common is flooding the engine. This usually happens when too much choke or priming is used. Another mistake is leaving the choke on too long after the engine starts, which can make the engine run rough or stall, especially if you try to apply throttle while that choke is open. Starting with the throttle open is another common issue. Most Rotax engines start best with the throttle closed or only slightly cracked open. Skipping the warm-up period is another mistake, especially with 2-stroke engines. Engines should always be allowed to reach a stable idle and begin warming up before applying power. And on 4-stroke engines, ignoring the oil pressure indication after startup can lead to serious problems. There are also a few habits that help make engine starting much more reliable. Keeping carburetors properly maintained, maintaining a healthy battery, and using the correct fuel all help make starting easier. It's also important to follow the manufacturer's recommendations and understand the specific starting procedures for your aircraft installation, since different airframes sometimes have slightly different setups. In the end, Rotax engines are very reliable starters when they're maintained and operated correctly. The key is understanding the difference between cold and warm engines, using the choke properly, avoiding flooding, and allowing the engine to warm up before applying power. If you follow those habits, your Rotax engine will usually start quickly and reliably. And finally, if you're interested in powered parachute flight instruction in either the Midwest or Florida, visit easyflight.com. And if you have any questions about Rotax engines, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and blue skies.